Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and I want to talk about Ryan Reynolds' 2024 movie, If, Imaginary Friend, right? And I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons from the perspective of this film. So let's jump into this. So this was a fantastic failure. This movie was abominably bad. It was extremely bad film. I walked out of it frustrated that like it raised all these great questions, but it didn't have any good answers, right? And so one of the questions that should have been answered before John Krasinski wrote this film, before John Krasinski finished writing this film, or actually before he even put his pen to paper, he should have answered one question: why do some kids create an imaginary friend and some do not? That's an important question, right? Now, actually, we're not going to answer that question here. We're going to answer the adult question. Why do some adults play Dungeons and Dragons and some do not? The reason we're going to answer that question is it's the same question, in my humble opinion. So the movie talks about ifs, imaginary friends. We, in Dungeons and Dragons world, deal with imaginary fighters. Now, fighter is a term for one class. I'm using it generically here, right? We have imaginary, I don't even think it's appropriate to say imaginary. I think it's better to say intangible fighters. And those fighters are wizards and clerics and rogues and fighters, but it's all of the Dragon Master characters, right? The player characters. We have these, right? So why did I sit down and create a Dragon Master character? Why did you do it? And why will some people literally never do it? You know the person I'm talking about. You go to some institution that you go to, you know, weekly, right? And you say, "Hey, you want to come play Dungeons and Dragons?" They're like, "No, of course not," right? And and some people even before, like people who have never played a board game, they're never going to play Dungeons and Dragons ever, right? And we forget this, right? We forget this within our sphere. There are a ton of people who don't even play board games, right? And the leap from board game to Dungeons and Dragons is it's 1,000 yards, right? It's 1,000 yard leap, right? With jagged rocks below. Right? So why do we do this? Well, I think it's I've thought about this, and so first, courage. We have courage, right? What we do in Dungeons and Dragons is fundamentally countercultural, right? People don't understand it. They're like, wait a second, you're going to pretend to be somebody else for 4 hours? And you're like, well, that's not, I understand you would frame it that way. That's not correct. But we are going to explore an additional identity for 2 hours, right? Would you be interested in that? They're like, no, that sounds like what I said with just different numbers and slightly different words, right? Like, and you're like, well, okay, I'm following you, right? And you don't want to come, explore an additional identity for 2 hours. And the reason why is they know any conversation they have, and they try to explain that to a spouse, they try to explain that to any other person, it is astounding me. Like, there are places I go and people will start a conversation about grout, and you're like, and they'll talk for a long time about it, right? And then I get in other places and they're like, let's talk about insurance. Like, and I'm like, what is your world? How can you, like, you clearly have only seen the sunset on one world, the sunrise on one world. Like, who talks about grout, like, for an hour? Ugh, it's wild. So so it takes courage to be countercultural. Next, it takes intellectual ambition, right? Because what you're doing is you're valuing the intangible. It's more than having an imagination. People are like, imagination. It's like the SpongeBob meme. They're like, what you need to play Dungeons and Dragons is imagination. I'm like, no, that's really not what you need at all. You need charisma, confidence, intelligence, and you need intellectual ambition. You are going to trade your time for something intangible. What is that something intangible? I'm beginning to think the best way to describe it is I have watched the sunrise on 30 worlds, right? Me, I've like been in my character and watched the sunrise on 30 worlds. And each one of those worlds has different cultures, different laws, different, rituals, different compounds, different colors, different smells. It's just And it has made my life richer. And I cannot imagine being bound to one identity at this point, right? I'm manifold sentient. You're manifold sentient. Could you imagine not being that? Being bound sentient, bound to one identity? It's abominable, right? Like it's unthinkable, right? So the other thing that we need is this intellectual ambition, right? And we have it. And this is why we play Dungeons and Dragons, because we have courage, we're willing to take the slings and arrows for being countercultural, and we have intellectual ambition. And the people who are invited, who say no, they lack courage and they lack intellectual ambition. Doesn't mean they lack ambition, right? Like, and what is their ambition for? It's for money, it's for fame, it's for acceptance, right? But we value seeing the sunrise on a new world. It's a big deal. It's majorly important. It's significant. Every single word you just heard is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider like and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.